In this next unit, we are going to focus solely on the cardiovascular system. We're going to spend a lot of time delving deep into the cardiovascular system over an entire unit. So only really one chapter is going to be covered. So we're going to get to really learn a lot of the specifics about how the cardiovascular system works and responds to exercise. So why is the cardiovascular system so important? Ultimately, it is one of the most key parts in maintaining homeostasis, because when we exercise, we put a large demand for need for oxygen and energy requirement in our muscles, and the way that we get it there is our cardiovascular system. And one of the things that we've learned is the cardiovascular system is so important because it is, one, a big area of disease. Cardiovascular disease is one of the major killers in the United States, and exercise can have lots of beneficial effects on that. So we'll touch a little bit on that as we go. To get started, though, what we really need to do is understand the structure and function of the cardiovascular disease, and then work our way into some of the more interesting aspects of how exercise and disease affect the cardiovascular system. So for this first lecture, we really need you to just be able to outline the basic structure and function of the cardiovascular system. We're going to get into the heart, arteries, arterioles, veins, venules, and capillaries. Then we'll talk about essentially the heartbeat or cardiac cycle, how we control it, how we can turn heart rate up or down. That'll be very important, of course, when we get into exercise. And then the way we measure heart rate is essentially an echocardiogram. And so we'll give you a very cursory idea of how to explain and interpret an EKG. So what is the circulatory system? The circulatory system works hand in hand with the pulmonary system in order to work together to deliver oxygen and blood to skeletal muscles. So therefore, it's very, very common for the circulatory systems to link in the cardiorespiratory, or call it the cardiopulmonary system. Again, very similar to what we saw early in the semester where we lump neuro and muscle together, right? Because we need that neural innervation to stimulate muscle, and we put them together a lot. The same goes for the cardiovascular system. So we're going to cover cardio here, and then we'll get into the respiratory or pulmonary side of things in the next unit. The three primary purposes of the cardiorespiratory system is one, to transport oxygen and nutrients such as glucose or fatty acids to the tissue, right? We're trying to get that in exercise to skeletal muscle so that it can use those for a fuel source. Oxygen can act as that final electron acceptor, as we learned in the last module. We can break down both glucose and fatty acids for large amounts of ATP to stimulate and maintain muscle contractions. It's also important in the removal of carbon dioxide and waste from the tissue. Again, we know that one of the major byproducts of the Krebs cycle is creating CO2 from each of the carbons from glucose, and so we can help remove CO2 from the tissue and breathe that out. And then last but not least, again, this is very important in Texas, is the idea that the cardiorespiratory system is an important regulator of body temperature, right? So we can get blood flow to our skin so that we can help dissipate body heat and help regulate, and that, as we'll talk about later on in the semester. And then again, in order to really get into the exercise physiology of this, think of this as that metabolic supply and demand. Again, that idea, I think, is just a foundational concept of exercise physiology. We talked about it before in supplying glucose to make ATP. Here, we're going to talk about supplying oxygen and glucose to the muscle so that that metabolic demand can be met. So to do that, we need to do two things that we're going to focus on later on in the lectures. One is we're going to have to increase our cardiac output, or better yet, easier said before we get into the definitions of cardiac output, is just we need to increase the amount of blood that we are pumping and flowing in our body, right? So increase the amount of flow in our body, increase the increase in oxygen and nutrients will improve just by that. Second, we'll talk about this is we'll also redistribute blood flow. So as you might imagine, we're going to send a lot to skeletal muscle in order to maintain that active level. Okay, so how do we define and discuss the circulatory system itself? So this is the components of the cardiovascular system. So the first is the big muscle pump, right? This is of course, the heart. Should be a review for most of you guys, but the heart is just the pump that is going to create a large amount of pressure in order to pump blood into all areas and cells in our body, which is pretty impressive if you think about it. The way that it delivers that blood is through arteries and arterioles. The idea is that arteries are there to carry blood away from the heart, right? And in most cases, they're going to carry oxygenated blood, except for in the pulmonary arteries, which are taking blood away from the heart, but to the lungs to get oxygenated and then coming back. And so we can't say it's a blanket statement that it's always oxygenated, but it almost always is, right? As we leave the heart and blood comes into arteries, arteries usually start out really big. And then get smaller, so we may have a large artery that gets then a smaller artery, and then ultimately we get smaller arterioles. These are usually when we enter the tissue bed. Okay. So these arterioles are important in being really small and being able to get into things like skeletal muscle. Right. We then have the exchange zone. The exchange zone is what takes place in what is known as capillaries. These are very small vessels, just about the size of a red blood cell that can squeeze through there. And what it does is it creates this massive amount of surface area so that we can easily drop off and exchange oxygen, CO2, and nutrients between the tissue and the cardiovascular system here. Once we've made that exchange, we're maybe lower on oxygen, higher on CO2. What we need to do is get rid of that waste and get more oxygen back in so that we can deliver more in the next pump. And the way that we do that is to go from capillaries into these smaller return vessels, which are called venules, and they will start carrying blood back to the heart. The small ones are venules, and then as we get larger, we get the veins, which then pump blood back into the heart, and we're able to start that all over again. So if we think about the cardiorespiratory system as a functional unit and kind of put the two of them together, we can break them into two halves, right? So first we have the pulmonary circuit. This includes the right side of the heart, and what I mean by right side of the heart is the right atria and ventricle. Right? So these are going to be pumping deoxygenated blood to the lungs via pulmonary arteries. As I mentioned previously, arteries almost always carry oxygenated blood. This is the one example of when it is not carrying oxygenated blood, when it's going to the lungs. So as you can see, we pump it out, we come into our pulmonary arteries, we then exchange oxygen and CO2 in our lungs, and we get nice bright red blood, which is what we consider oxygenated, coming back into the left side of the heart. Right? The left side of the heart is what we call the systemic circuit, or otherwise the idea of the blood is going to the entire body system in order to deliver these oxygen and nutrients that it's picked up. The systemic circuit is the left side of the heart. Same here, the left atria and ventricle. So these are going to be your heavy workers, right? So your left ventricle is going to be your biggest muscle, going to be doing the most work because it's got to pump blood to your entire body, and it will, of course, pump oxygenated blood through arteries and returns deoxygenated blood from the right side of the heart, or blood from the veins into the right side of the heart, and restarts this entire process. So again, right side of the heart pumps to the pulmonary artery. It then is oxygenated, comes back into the left side of the heart, into the left atria, then left ventricle, pumps it out into the system. As you can see, we go out of arteries, then we get into smaller arterioles, and then finally into capillary beds where exchange happens, and then we send it back into the venules, which then turn into larger vessels, which are veins, and then they deliver it back into the right atria and are ready to go again and start pumping it into the lungs to reoxygenate. So let's take a look further into the heart. You guys should be fairly familiar with the structure of the heart, but we can divide the heart simply into 4 chambers. Again, as we break it into what we talked about in the last slide, we can really divide this into 2 halves, right? So our right side and our left side. Again, right side delivering blood to the lungs for reoxygenation, and then the left side delivering it to the systemic body. That's why the systemic side and pulmonary side. Again, 4 chambers, but we can call it 2 pumps. The right pump, which is the right atrium and ventricle, and the left pump. They are separated by a muscular wall called the interventricular septum, which essentially prevents any mixing of blood from the non-oxygenated or blue side and the oxygenated side here. And we can also kind of use this wall to help push and force blood out when we contract the ventricles in order to squeeze it into the arteries. If we continue into the structure of the heart, not only do we have that septum to divide the heart in half, again we have these valves which will ultimately make it a 4-chamber heart in order to prevent any backflow or mixing of blood. And again, this is important because as we think about later, as this contracts, that our atria is going to push blood into here. We don't want anytime we contract blood going back into the atria and back into the vein side of things. We want to focus all of our pressure and eject all the blood out of the vein or out into the arteries and into either the lungs or the systemic system. So to do that, we have a couple of one-way valves. The first is the tricuspid valve or the right atrioventricular valve. Either one, for most people, I would say the atrioventricular valve is an easier term to memorize because we have the atria and the ventricle and the valve in between them. So that makes sense. And then dividing the atrium and the ventricle in the left side of the heart is the bicuspid valve, or easier said than done is the left AV or atrioventricular valve. Again, probably easier for you to remember that, and any questions would allow either of those answers. We also need valves to be able to block up blood flow in the arteries in order to build up pressure. The valves that do this are first the pulmonary valve, which is here, which blocks the ventricle from the pulmonary artery. And then we have the mitral valve or the aortic semilunar valve, either way you look at it. So that is blocking into the aorta or the major arteries. I bring up that mitral valve because it's really important because in a lot of females, that's actually the valve that fails most in females and has to be replaced because it ultimately causes the heart to not function very well, causes the heart to work really hard in order to push blood against that because of a leaky valve. Okay, so if we look to finish off the structure of the heart, what we see again is here is a nice view with the flow of the blood. So blood will come in from the superior vena cava, which is the major vein that feeds into the heart. It then comes into the right atrium to fill. That is then pushed by the right atrioventricular valve into the right ventricle, which is then pumped blood from the right ventricle into the pulmonary artery. We have a right and a left that goes to the left or right lungs. Once it goes to the lungs, it then comes back oxygenated. Since it's coming back, it now becomes a vein. Again, we have a left and a right pulmonary vein bringing blood back to the heart. It then enters into the left atrium. It fills the left atrium now with oxygenated blood, which then sends blood into the left ventricle, which is then pumped out through the aorta, which then enters everything from your brain, this pathway, to your arms, your legs, your toes, everything all in one. So that will ultimately wrap up the first structure and function video of the cardiovascular system. In the next section, we're going to break down actually what the muscle inside the heart looks like and how it works.